Welcome to Smart Reads in Minutes. Today we're diving into Scattered Minds by Gabor Maté with a detailed chapter-by-chapter summary. Let's get started. Introduction. Gabor Maté opens Scattered Minds by addressing the fundamental misunderstandings surrounding attention deficit disorder, ADD. He critiques the binary perspectives often presented in discussions about the disorder, one side attributing it entirely to genetics, the other blaming poor parenting. Instead, Maté proposes a more nuanced view, emphasizing the complex interplay between hereditary factors and early environmental influences. He argues that while ADD has a genetic component, its manifestation is significantly shaped by childhood experiences, including parental emotional states and social stressors. The prevailing discourse, which either pathologizes ADD as an immutable condition or dismisses it as the result of inadequate discipline, fails to consider the malleability of the human brain and the potential for healing and transformation. Maté brings personal insight into the discussion, revealing that he himself has ADD and that his 3 children have been diagnosed with the condition. This first-hand experience informs his approach, making his exploration of ADD not just theoretical, but deeply personal. He underscores the importance of recognizing that the brain circuits are shaped by both biology and environment. Neuroscience, he explains, has demonstrated that early relational experiences play a crucial role in brain development. The emotional climate in which a child is raised, particularly the attunement and responsiveness of caregivers, profoundly influences neural pathways related to attention, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Anticipating potential criticism, Maté explicitly rejects the notion that discussing environmental influences equates to blaming parents. He acknowledges that parents of children with ADD often face immense judgment from society, being unfairly accused of failing to provide proper discipline or structure. Instead, he argues that parents themselves are often part of a generational cycle, passing down patterns of stress and dysregulation that they too have inherited. Rather than assigning blame, his goal is to foster understanding and provide a pathway toward healing. He emphasizes that change is possible, both in childhood and adulthood, if the right conditions for brain development and emotional healing are cultivated. To illustrate the subjective experience of ADD, Maté shares an analogy offered by a doctor. Imagine being in a room filled with people talking simultaneously, and then being asked to focus on a single conversation. This, he explains, is what living with ADD can feel like, a constant barrage of stimuli with an impaired ability to filter and focus. He also suggests a parallel analogy for parents of children with ADD. The overwhelming sense of uncertainty, pressure, and self-doubt they often face as they navigate conflicting advice and social scrutiny. Throughout Scattered Minds, Maté aims to reframe ADD not as an inherent defect, but as a condition that arises from a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental influences. He insists that the disorder is not a life sentence and that significant improvements can be achieved through greater awareness, conscious parenting, and targeted interventions. His approach is both compassionate and empowering, encouraging readers to shift their perspective from one of helplessness to one of active engagement with their own neurobiology and personal history. Chapter 1. So Much Soup and Garbage Can. Gabor Maté begins this chapter with an anecdote about a patient who described his life as so much soup and garbage can. The phrase, though ambiguous, encapsulates the confusion, chaos, and distress experienced by many individuals with ADD. It suggests a mixture of overwhelming emotions and fragmented thoughts, a common experience for those struggling with the condition. Maté reflects on how this seemingly nonsensical expression conveys deep feelings of frustration, loneliness, and self-doubt, highlighting the difficulties in articulating the experience of ADD. He introduces the concept of ADD as a state of mind where one's thoughts, emotions, and actions appear to be in perpetual disorder. People with ADD often feel disconnected from themselves and their surroundings, unable to find a structured path in life. Maté explains that their perception of reality is fragmented. Their attention drifts involuntarily, and they often feel as though they are watching life happen to them rather than actively participating in it. This profound sense of disorganization makes even routine tasks feel insurmountable. Maté recalls his own journey in understanding ADD, which ironically began when he decided to write a medical column on the subject. As he researched, he came to recognize himself in the descriptions of the condition, leading to a personal epiphany. He describes how ADD had always been a hidden force in his life, shaping his behavior and interactions without him realizing it. This moment of realization, which he refers to as the ADD epiphany, was both enlightening and overwhelming. Suddenly, the struggles he had faced throughout his life, his restlessness, his difficulty focusing, and his tendency to be easily overwhelmed, made sense within a broader framework. One of the most challenging aspects of ADD, he notes, is the internal chaos it creates. People with ADD may have an intense inner world, but struggle to express their thoughts clearly. Their minds jump from one idea to another, making it difficult to complete tasks or hold conversations in a linear fashion. Socially, they may feel like outsiders, watching others interact effortlessly while they struggle with small talk or social norms. This feeling of alienation often leads to self-doubt and low self-esteem. Despite the challenges, Maté emphasizes that ADD is not just a disorder, it is also a different way of experiencing the world. While it can create difficulties in focus and organization, it also brings creativity, spontaneity, and unique ways of thinking. He suggests that the goal is not to fix ADD, but to understand and manage it in a way that allows individuals to harness their strengths while minimizing the struggles that come with it. Chapter 2. Many Roads Not Traveled. Maté explores the nature of ADD through the metaphor of roads not taken, drawing from the experiences of those who feel as though they have missed out on life's opportunities due to their struggles with focus and follow-through. People with ADD frequently describe a sense of lost potential, an awareness that they could have achieved more if only they had been able to stay on track. He explains that this regret often manifests as feelings of failure, shame, and a longing for paths they were unable to pursue. A central theme of this chapter is the impact of ADD on life choices. Many individuals with ADD struggle with decision-making, often feeling paralyzed by the multitude of options available to them. This indecisiveness can lead to avoidance, causing them to miss out on opportunities that might have been fulfilling. Even when they do make decisions, they may struggle to follow through, leading to a pattern of abandoned projects, uncompleted tasks, and a trail of unfinished ideas. This cycle reinforces feelings of self-doubt and frustration. Maté discusses how people with ADD often experience a constant battle between their intentions and their actions. They may have grand visions and ambitions, but find themselves unable to execute their plans effectively. This creates a gap between what they know they are capable of and what they actually accomplish, further deepening their sense of disappointment. He explains that this discrepancy is not due to a lack of intelligence or motivation, but rather a neurological challenge in maintaining focus and consistency. The chapter also examines the role of impulse control in ADD. Many roads remain untaken not because they were unavailable, but because impulsivity led to decisions that veered individuals away from long-term goals. People with ADD often act on immediate desires rather than strategic planning, leading them into situations they later regret. For example, they may take on new projects without considering the commitment required, leading to burnout or disillusionment. This pattern can be frustrating, as it prevents them from achieving stability and long-term success. Despite these struggles, Maté argues that understanding ADD allows individuals to reclaim control over their lives. Recognizing the underlying mechanisms of their behavior helps them develop strategies to manage their impulses, improve decision-making, and create structured routines that support their goals. He suggests that rather than mourning the roads not taken, people with ADD should focus on the paths still available to them. By accepting their unique way of thinking and working within its framework, they can find fulfillment without being trapped by regret. Chapter 3, We Could All Go Crazy. In this chapter, Maté explores the skepticism and controversy surrounding ADD as a diagnosis. He acknowledges that ADD has often been dismissed as a fad, a product of overdiagnosis, or an excuse for poor behavior. Critics argue that the symptoms of ADD, distraction, impulsivity, restlessness, are present to some degree in everyone, raising the question of whether ADD is a distinct medical condition or simply a variation of normal human behavior. Maté confronts these criticisms directly, examining the ways in which ADD is both overdiagnosed and misunderstood. He explains that while the traits associated with ADD exist on a continuum, what distinguishes the disorder is the extent to which these traits impair daily functioning. Everyone experiences moments of forgetfulness or inattention, but for those with ADD, these issues are persistent and significantly disrupt their ability to manage work, relationships, and responsibilities. The challenge, he notes, is that society tends to medicalize behavior without fully understanding its roots. The increasing reliance on medications like Ritalin has led some to argue that ADD is simply a convenient label used to control children who do not conform to rigid educational or behavioral expectations. Maté expresses concern about the overuse of medication, questioning whether society is too quick to medicate children rather than addressing the environmental factors contributing to their struggles. He argues that while medication can be helpful, it should not be the default solution. The widespread prescription of stimulants without a deeper exploration of underlying issues reflects a broader societal tendency to seek quick fixes rather than addressing the root causes of distress. He calls for a more holistic approach, one that considers the emotional, psychological, and social dimensions of ADD rather than focusing solely on pharmaceutical intervention. At the same time, Maté rejects the notion that ADD is a purely social construct. He emphasizes that neurobiological factors play a critical role and that dismissing ADD as a fabricated disorder invalidates the real struggles of those affected by it. However, he insists that understanding the environmental influences on ADD is equally important. The way a child is raised, the stress levels they are exposed to, and their early attachment experiences all shape brain development. He suggests that rather than viewing ADD as an immutable condition, it should be seen as a dynamic interplay between genetics and environment. Ultimately, Maté advocates for a balanced perspective, one that acknowledges the reality of ADD while challenging the ways in which it has been pathologized. He argues that rather than labeling people as disordered, we should focus on helping them develop tools to navigate their unique challenges. By shifting the conversation from blame and diagnosis to understanding and support, society can better serve those living with ADD, allowing them to thrive without being constrained by stigma or pharmaceutical dependency. Chapter 4, A Conflictual Marriage, ADD and the Family. Gabor Maté opens this chapter by describing how conflict in a marriage can create an emotionally unstable environment that affects both partners and, crucially, their children. He draws from his own experience, recounting the struggles he and his wife, Ray, faced over decades. Despite being a financially stable, middle-class couple with no history of substance abuse or violence, they still experience significant marital strife. He argues that ADD is not solely a genetic condition, nor is it entirely caused by the environment. Instead, it emerges from an interaction between inherited predispositions and the emotional atmosphere in which a child develops. Maté describes how their marriage was characterized by periods of intense conflict, alternating with equally intense closeness, a pattern common in many relationships. These cycles, he explains, can have an addictive quality. People don't seek conflict, but they also don't know how to interact without it. Even though he and Ray ultimately worked through their difficulties, he acknowledges the impact their emotional struggles had on their children, all of whom were diagnosed with ADD. He references Carl Rogers, the renowned psychotherapist, who once reflected on how his own marital growth did not necessarily benefit his children, reinforcing the idea that parental love does not always translate into emotional security for children. Maté emphasizes that stress within a family can have profound developmental effects, especially on highly sensitive children. He describes how his frustrations with life sometimes erupted into anger or emotional withdrawal, affecting not only his relationship with Ray, but also with their children. Even though he was a caring and compassionate doctor to his patients, his unresolved anxieties surfaced in his home life. This contradiction, being highly responsive to the needs of others while struggling to maintain emotional balance at home, is a common trait among parents with ADD. He also examines the societal expectations placed on parents, particularly fathers, to be providers and protectors, often at the cost of their emotional presence. Maté himself was constantly overcommitted to work, juggling multiple demanding roles in addition to his medical practice. He found it difficult to say no to responsibilities outside his home, while often neglecting those within it. He reflects on how his compulsive work habits and need for external validation contributed to the stress within his household. He argues that this pattern is not unique to him, but is prevalent among many individuals with ADD who struggle with setting boundaries and prioritizing their personal lives. Ultimately, Maté asserts that parents' unresolved emotional conflicts and anxieties inevitably affect their children's development. Even in families where love is abundant, the presence of unresolved tensions can shape a child's neurobiology, increasing their susceptibility to ADD. He stresses that addressing these underlying emotional patterns is crucial, not only for the well-being of the parents, but also for the long-term health and stability of their children. Chapter 5. Forgetting to Remember the Future. Maté explores the concept of time blindness in individuals with ADD, illustrating how their perception of time is fundamentally different from those without the condition. He begins with a personal anecdote about being chronically late, describing how he frequently misjudges how long tasks will take. He explains that people with ADD often live in a state of magical thinking regarding time, assuming that everything will somehow work out, despite clear evidence to the contrary. This distorted perception of time leads to persistent procrastination, missed deadlines, and frustration, both for the individual with ADD and those around them. One of the most distinctive characteristics of ADD, Maté argues, is an impaired ability to plan for the future. He cites Dr. Russell Barkley's research on ADD as a disorder of executive function, particularly in terms of delayed gratification and long-term planning. Individuals with ADD tend to prioritize immediate impulses over long-term goals, which often results in repeated cycles of short-term satisfaction followed by regret. For example, someone with ADD might consistently choose to engage in an enjoyable activity instead of completing an important task, despite knowing that it will lead to negative consequences later. Maté likens the time perception of individuals with ADD to that of young children, for whom time is divided into two categories: now and not now. This explains why many people with ADD struggle with deadlines, schedules, and future-oriented thinking. They find it difficult to conceptualize future consequences in the present moment, leading to impulsivity and last-minute decision-making. This inability to anticipate and plan for the future can affect multiple areas of life, from finances to career development to relationships. Another key issue is the difficulty people with ADD have in sustaining motivation unless they are faced with an immediate deadline or reward. Maté describes how he, like many individuals with ADD, only feels truly motivated when under pressure. This reliance on adrenaline-fueled urgency often leads to cycles of procrastination, followed by frantic bursts of productivity. While this method may allow them to complete tasks, it is ultimately unsustainable and contributes to chronic stress and burnout. Maté argues that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward change. By acknowledging the way their brain processes time, individuals with ADD can develop strategies to manage their tendencies, such as setting artificial deadlines, using external reminders, and breaking tasks into smaller, more immediate steps. He concludes that overcoming time blindness requires both awareness and intentional effort, as well as support from those who understand the challenges of living with ADD. Chapter 6: Different Worlds, Heredity and the Environments of Childhood. In this chapter, Maté challenges the dominant belief that ADD is primarily a genetic disorder. He critiques what he calls genetic fundamentalism, the tendency to attribute personality traits and mental health conditions entirely to DNA. While he acknowledges that heredity plays a role in ADD, he argues that environmental factors are equally, if not more, important in determining whether a child will develop the condition. Maté presents the story of the Gilmore family as an example of how environment shapes development. He contrasts the vastly different childhoods experienced by the brothers in the family, illustrating how siblings growing up in the same household can have completely different emotional realities. One brother, raised in a period of family violence and instability, developed severe behavioral issues, while another, born during a more stable period, had a significantly different upbringing. This example underscores Maté's argument that ADD and other developmental challenges are not predetermined by genetics alone, but are significantly influenced by the emotional climate of early childhood. He also discusses the impact of birth order on development. The firstborn child often experiences undivided parental attention, but may later feel displaced by younger siblings, while the youngest child may struggle to establish independence in a family where roles have already been defined. These subtle dynamics contribute to differences in personality and behavior among siblings, further illustrating that the environment plays a critical role in shaping a child's development. Maté emphasizes that the most significant environmental factor is the emotional state of the parents. He explains that children absorb not just their parents' actions, but also their unspoken anxieties, frustrations, and unresolved trauma. A child's developing brain is highly sensitive to the emotional climate of the home, and persistent stress or tension can impact neural development. He argues that many cases of ADD are rooted in early childhood experiences of emotional disconnection rather than solely in genetics. He concludes by advocating for a broader perspective on ADD, one that moves beyond genetic determinism to consider the full spectrum of biological and environmental influences. By recognizing the role of early relationships and emotional experiences in shaping brain function, individuals with ADD and their families can develop more effective strategies for healing and growth. Chapter 7: Emotional Allergies, ADD and Sensitivity. In this chapter, Gabor Maté explores the concept of emotional sensitivity in individuals with ADD, likening it to a form of emotional allergy. He begins with a compelling analogy. Just as some people have physical allergies that make them hyperreactive to substances others barely notice, people with ADD are often hypersensitive to emotional stimuli. This heightened reactivity is not a flaw, but an inborn trait. It is not ADD itself that is hereditary, Maté argues, but rather the trait of sensitivity, which then interacts with environmental influences to produce the disorder. Maté explains that ADD children and adults frequently experience the world as if they have thin skin. Their nervous systems are highly attuned to stimuli that others might ignore. This makes them more prone to strong emotional reactions, particularly in situations involving stress, criticism, or interpersonal conflict. Parents of ADD children often notice that their child overreacts to minor frustrations or perceived slights, becoming overwhelmed by emotions that others might brush off. adults with ADD may also find themselves struggling with disproportionate responses to workplace conflicts, personal relationships, or daily inconveniences. The link between ADD and physical health conditions further supports Maté's argument. He notes that ADD children are more likely to suffer from allergies, asthma, eczema, and frequent colds. While some researchers have speculated that allergies might cause ADD, Maté clarifies that both are actually symptoms of the same underlying trait, sensitivity. This trait manifests both physiologically, as in allergies, and emotionally, as in heightened reactivity to stress and relationships. Emotional hypersensitivity can make daily interactions feel like an assault, leading to increased frustration, withdrawal, or defensiveness. Maté also examines how ADD children's emotional responses are often misunderstood. They may be labeled as too sensitive or accused of overreacting to situations, much like a person with hay fever might be told to just stop sneezing. However, he stresses that their reactions are real and valid, stemming from their nervous system's heightened state of alert. Adults often fail to recognize that what may seem like an overreaction is, in fact, a natural response for the child. This misunderstanding can create cycles of conflict between ADD children and their caregivers, where the child's distress is dismissed, leading to further frustration and emotional dysregulation. Finally, Maté introduces the idea that the nervous system of a hypersensitive child functions like an exposed nerve, highly reactive and easily overwhelmed. This reactivity is influenced not only by external circumstances, but also by internal factors such as anxiety, stress hormones, and childhood experiences. Emotional security, he argues, is crucial in helping ADD individuals regulate their sensitivity. When surrounded by calm, understanding caregivers, they can learn to manage their emotions more effectively. Without this support, however, they may develop maladaptive coping mechanisms, such as withdrawal, defiance, or emotional shutdown. Understanding ADD as a condition rooted in sensitivity, rather than as a mere disorder of attention, shifts the focus from symptom suppression to emotional attunement and healing. Chapter 8: A Surrealistic Choreography. In this chapter, Maté delves into the chaotic, unpredictable nature of ADD, describing it as a surrealistic choreography in which a person's thoughts, emotions, and actions seem to move in disjointed and unexpected ways. He examines how individuals with ADD struggle with maintaining a coherent flow in their daily lives, often feeling as though they are being pulled in different directions without a clear sense of structure or control. One of the core challenges of ADD, Maté explains, is the brain's inability to maintain consistent focus and organization. This manifests in various ways, from forgetting important appointments to jumping from task to task without completing anything. The person with ADD may start the day with the intention of finishing a project, but instead finds themselves distracted by unrelated activities. The pattern is not one of simple laziness or lack of discipline, but rather a reflection of the brain's difficulty in sustaining attention and resisting impulsive urges. Maté also explores how ADD affects movement and coordination. Many children and adults with ADD display clumsiness or difficulty in physical coordination, which he attributes to the disorder's broader impact on brain function. The choreography of their movements, whether in sports, dance, or even simple everyday activities, often appears erratic or uncoordinated. This difficulty extends beyond physical movement to thought processes and speech patterns, where interruptions, sudden shifts in focus, and incomplete sentences are common. Another critical aspect of this surrealistic choreography is emotional unpredictability. People with ADD may seem perfectly calm one moment and then suddenly overwhelmed by frustration or excitement the next. Maté compares this to a dance with no fixed steps, where emotions and thoughts lead in unpredictable directions. This emotional instability can be particularly challenging in relationships, as partners, friends, and family members may struggle to understand or keep up with the rapid shifts in mood and focus. Despite these challenges, Maté also highlights the creativity and spontaneity that come with ADD. The same brain processes that make sustained focus difficult can also contribute to innovative thinking and unique problem-solving abilities. Many artists, inventors, and visionaries throughout history have displayed traits consistent with ADD, suggesting that its characteristics, while disruptive in certain contexts, can also be sources of strength when properly channeled. However, without support and strategies to manage these traits, individuals with ADD may feel trapped in a cycle of frustration and self-doubt, unable to harness their potential effectively. Maté concludes the chapter by emphasizing the importance of recognizing and working with the natural rhythms of an ADD brain rather than forcing it into conventional structures that may not be suitable. By understanding the neurological underpinnings of ADD, individuals can develop coping mechanisms that allow them to navigate their unique choreography with greater ease and self-acceptance. Chapter 9. Attunement and Attachment. In this chapter, Maté explores how the development of ADD is closely linked to early childhood experiences, particularly the quality of attunement and attachment between parent and child. He argues that ADD is not simply a genetic condition, but is shaped by the emotional environment of infancy and early childhood. The ability of a parent to attune to their child, meaning to be emotionally present and responsive, plays a crucial role in shaping the child's developing brain. Maté describes attunement as the process through which an infant learns to regulate emotions and develop a sense of security. When a parent is emotionally attuned, they respond to their child's needs with warmth and consistency. This secure connection helps the child feel safe and understood, laying the foundation for healthy emotional regulation and attention. However, when a parent is stressed, distracted, or emotionally unavailable, the child may struggle to develop these essential skills, leading to the attention and impulse control difficulties characteristic of ADD. He emphasizes that attunement is not about physical presence alone, but about the quality of emotional engagement. A parent who is physically present but emotionally distant, perhaps due to their own stress or unresolved trauma, may unintentionally disrupt the child's developing ability to self-regulate. Infants are highly sensitive to their caregiver's emotional state, and if they sense inconsistency or disconnection, they may internalize feelings of insecurity that persist into adulthood. Maté also discusses how attachment, the deep instinctual bond between a child and caregiver, plays a role in ADD. A child who experiences inconsistent or insecure attachment may grow up with heightened anxiety and difficulty concentrating as their brain remains in a state of hypervigilance. This constant state of alertness can interfere with the ability to focus, process information, and regulate impulses. Ultimately, Maté argues that addressing ADD requires more than just behavioral interventions or medication. It requires a deeper understanding of the emotional and relational factors that contribute to its development. By fostering secure attachments and improving emotional attunement, both children and adults with ADD can begin to heal the underlying patterns that drive their struggles with attention and self-regulation. Chapter 10. The Footprints of Infancy. Gabor Maté explores the profound impact of early childhood experiences on brain development, particularly in shaping attention regulation, impulse control, and emotional resilience. He emphasizes that the first years of life leave footprints in the brain, influencing how individuals process emotions and interact with the world. This chapter introduces the orbitofrontal cortex, a crucial part of the brain responsible for emotional self-regulation, impulse control, and social intelligence. Located behind the forehead, this region undergoes rapid development in infancy and is highly sensitive to environmental influences. If a child's early experiences are stressful or emotionally inconsistent, the growth of these brain circuits can be disrupted, leading to difficulties with attention and emotional regulation later in life. Maté argues that ADD is not merely a product of genetics, but a condition that emerges from a combination of biological predisposition and early environmental stressors. He describes studies showing how infants who experience consistent emotional attunement from their caregivers develop stronger connections in the prefrontal cortex. This secure foundation helps them regulate emotions and maintain focus as they grow. However, if a caregiver is emotionally unavailable, stressed, or inconsistent, the child's brain does not receive the necessary stimulation to develop these regulatory circuits effectively. As a result, the child may grow up with a heightened stress response, increased impulsivity, and difficulty sustaining attention. Drawing from neuroscience, Maté explains that the production of dopamine, a neurotransmitter crucial for motivation and attention, is heavily influenced by early interactions between infants and their caregivers. When a child experiences joy and connection with a parent, the brain releases dopamine, reinforcing neural pathways that support focus and motivation. If these positive interactions are lacking, the child's dopamine system may become underdeveloped, contributing to the inattentiveness and lack of motivation commonly seen in ADD. He cites research on both human and animal studies, showing that maternal care plays a direct role in shaping brain function related to stress regulation and attention. Maté also addresses the misconception that only extreme neglect or trauma can lead to these developmental issues. While severe deprivation undoubtedly has lasting consequences, he argues that even subtle forms of emotional disconnection, such as a parent being preoccupied with work, experiencing depression, or being unable to provide consistent emotional support, can have significant effects. This does not mean parents are to blame, as they are often dealing with their own unresolved stress and trauma. Instead, he encourages an awareness of how these early experiences shape children's neurodevelopment, offering the possibility of healing through later life interventions, such as therapy, mindfulness, and conscious parenting. Chapter 11: An Utter Stranger, ADD and the Family. Maté delves into the emotional and psychological impact of early childhood separation, using his own experiences as an example. Born in Budapest during World War II, he recounts how his mother was forced to give him up for a brief period to ensure his survival. When they were reunited weeks later, he did not recognize her and treated her as a stranger. This experience, he argues, left a deep imprint on his emotional development, reinforcing his belief that ADD is rooted in early disruptions of attachment rather than simply being a genetic disorder. He examines how early attachment disruptions, even those far less extreme than his own, can contribute to ADD. When a child's primary caregiver is emotionally unavailable, whether due to stress, depression, or external circumstances, the child may experience a sense of disconnection. This can lead to a heightened stress response, an increased tendency to tune out from reality, and difficulty forming secure relationships later in life. The impact is particularly strong in children who are naturally sensitive, as they are more attuned to subtle emotional shifts in their caregivers. Maté references studies showing that stress experienced by the mother during pregnancy and early childhood directly affects the development of the child's stress regulation systems. If a mother is anxious or depressed, her child is more likely to develop an overactive stress response, making them more prone to impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattentiveness. This heightened stress sensitivity is a key characteristic of ADD, and Maté argues that many individuals with the condition carry unresolved emotional pain from their early years. He also critiques the traditional medical view of ADD as purely a biological disorder, asserting that mainstream approaches often ignore the role of early relationships. Instead of simply medicating children, he advocates for addressing the underlying emotional patterns that contribute to their struggles. Healing, he suggests, comes from understanding the emotional roots of ADD and working to restore a sense of safety and connection within the individual's life. He highlights the importance of therapeutic relationships, mindfulness, and self-awareness as tools for mitigating the effects of early attachment wounds. Ultimately, Maté presents a compelling argument that ADD is not a static condition, but a response to early relational experiences. While medication may help manage symptoms, true healing requires addressing the underlying emotional patterns that have shaped the individual's development. This perspective offers a more compassionate and holistic understanding of ADD, moving beyond the conventional focus on behavior modification and toward a deeper exploration of human relationships and emotional resilience. Chapter 12, Stories Within Stories, ADD and the Family. Maté expands on the themes of family stress and intergenerational trauma, illustrating how ADD often emerges within a broader family context. He describes how parents who bring their children for ADD assessments are often dealing with their own unresolved emotional issues. Many of these parents exhibit ADD-like traits themselves, such as impulsivity, distractibility, or emotional dysregulation, even if they were never formally diagnosed. This suggests that ADD is not just a condition of individual children, but a manifestation of stress patterns passed down through generations. He emphasizes that stress within the family is not always obvious. Many parents assume that as long as there is no overt conflict, their children are not affected. However, Maté argues that children are highly attuned to their parents' emotional states, even when stress is not openly expressed. He recalls instances where parents denied experiencing family tension, only to later recognize that their home life was, in fact, filled with underlying stressors, such as work pressures, unresolved marital issues, or personal anxieties. Sensitive children, particularly those predisposed to ADD, are more likely to absorb these tensions, which can shape their brain development and coping mechanisms. Maté also discusses the role of divorce in shaping childhood stress. He challenges the common assumption that ADD symptoms emerge primarily after a traumatic event like divorce, arguing instead that the emotional strain leading up to the separation has a far greater impact. The months or years of unresolved conflict, tension, and emotional withdrawal between parents are what deeply affect a child's sense of security. Even in families that stay together, the presence of chronic stress can create similar effects, reinforcing ADD patterns in children who struggle to regulate their emotions in an unstable environment. One of the most striking aspects of this chapter is Maté's discussion of generational trauma. He argues that many parents unconsciously pass down their own unresolved childhood wounds to their children. This is not done intentionally, but rather as a result of unexamined emotional patterns. For example, a parent who grew up with an emotionally distant father may struggle to provide emotional attunement to their own children, perpetuating a cycle of disconnection. By understanding these family dynamics, individuals with ADD can begin to break free from inherited stress patterns and develop healthier coping mechanisms. Maté concludes by advocating for self-reflection and awareness as essential tools for healing. He urges parents to examine their own childhood experiences and emotional habits, recognizing how these factors influence their children's development. By fostering emotional attunement within families, individuals with ADD can move beyond inherited stress patterns and cultivate a greater sense of self-regulation and connection. Chapter 13, This Most Frenetic of Cultures, The Social Roots of ADD. Gabor Maté argues that the prevalence of ADD in modern society cannot be explained solely by genetic predisposition. Instead, he attributes much of the disorder's rise to the cultural and economic shifts that have shaped family life, parenting, and early childhood experiences over the past few decades. He begins by challenging the theory proposed by some researchers that ADD is more common in North America because it was inherited from adventurous or risk-taking ancestors who settled the continent. While this idea is psychologically appealing, he finds it historically and scientifically lacking, as the majority of immigrants were not adventurers, but individuals escaping economic hardship, oppression, and famine. Maté instead proposes that the increase in ADD cases is largely a product of societal changes that have disrupted family stability. He describes how economic pressures, shifting work environments, and the erosion of extended family support systems have contributed to increased parental stress. With parents increasingly occupied by work, financial struggles, and social demands, children are often deprived of consistent emotional attunement, which plays a crucial role in brain development. He links this disruption to the rise of ADD, suggesting that many children's developing nervous systems are failing to receive the necessary cues for emotional regulation and focus. He critiques how modern culture, particularly in North America, encourages a fast-paced, attention-fragmenting lifestyle that mirrors the symptoms of ADD. The explosion of rapid media consumption, shorter news cycles, and an increasing reliance on technology have all contributed to an environment where deep attention and focus are difficult to cultivate. Television, video games, and social media have conditioned individuals to expect constant stimulation, making it harder for children and adults to develop sustained focus. He points out that while such cultural influences do not cause ADD, they exacerbate the condition, making self-regulation even more difficult. Maté also examines the ways in which the educational system has changed to accommodate shorter attention spans rather than fostering deep learning. He contrasts older news programs where individuals spoke in full sentences with clear, uninterrupted thoughts to modern news media, which relies on sound bites and rapid cuts. The same trend is visible in entertainment, where quick scene changes and high-stimulation visuals dominate. He notes that the success of programs like Sesame Street was rooted in their ability to cater to children with already short attention spans, reinforcing rather than mitigating their difficulties in sustained focus. He concludes by emphasizing that while ADD is rooted in neurobiology, it does not exist in isolation from the broader social context. A culture that devalues deep focus, patience, and sustained effort makes it significantly harder for individuals with ADD to function. Instead of merely treating ADD with medication, he suggests that society as a whole should reconsider the structures and lifestyles that contribute to attention fragmentation, advocating for changes that support emotional attunement, family stability, and healthier developmental environments. Chapter 14. Severed Thoughts and Flibberty Gibbets. Distractability and Tuning Out. Maté explores the phenomenon of distractibility in individuals with ADD, arguing that it is not simply a matter of poor attention, but rather a defensive mechanism rooted in childhood experiences. He begins by discussing the psychological concept of dissociation, in which individuals mentally tune out from distressing situations. He suggests that ADD-related distractibility is a form of dissociation that develops in response to early emotional stress. When a child does not receive consistent emotional engagement from caregivers, their brain learns to escape into an internal world, making it difficult to remain present and focused in everyday life. He traces this dissociative response back to early development, explaining that tuning out is a survival strategy. When an infant or young child is unable to engage meaningfully with their caregiver, either because the caregiver is distracted, stressed, or emotionally unavailable, the child's brain adapts by withdrawing from the external world. This becomes a habitual pattern, leading to difficulties with sustained attention later in life. Maté draws a comparison to trauma survivors, who often dissociate from painful memories as a means of self-protection. While ADD may not always stem from extreme trauma, he argues that the same neurological mechanisms are at play. Using literary and historical references, he illustrates how distractibility has long been misunderstood. He cites King Lear, in which the character Gloucester describes how he would prefer to be distract rather than face his grief, showing that tuning out is often a way of avoiding emotional pain. In the modern world, this manifests in behaviors such as daydreaming, losing track of conversations, and struggling to complete tasks. He describes individuals with ADD as being highly engaged in their own internal thoughts, but unable to filter out external distractions, leading to a scattered and fragmented experience of reality. Maté also addresses how distractibility affects memory and learning. He notes that individuals with ADD often struggle with short-term recall because their attention is divided between multiple streams of thought. While most people can prioritize external stimuli over internal distractions, those with ADD find it difficult to maintain that balance. He describes how this can create frustration and self-doubt, as individuals feel incapable of focusing even when they genuinely want to. He argues that understanding ADD as a response to early emotional environments, rather than merely a deficit in attention, can help shift the conversation toward more compassionate and effective solutions. He concludes by emphasizing that distractibility is not a sign of laziness or lack of intelligence, but a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. By addressing the emotional roots of ADD, rather than merely treating its symptoms, individuals can begin to develop healthier ways of engaging with the world. He advocates for mindfulness practices, structured environments, and therapeutic approaches that help retrain the brain to remain present and focused, rather than continuing the cycle of dissociation and avoidance. Chapter 15. The Pendulum Swings: Hyperactivity, Lethargy, and Shame. Maté explores the opposing states of hyperactivity and lethargy in individuals with ADD, arguing that both are expressions of underlying emotional distress. He begins by describing how many individuals with ADD experience constant mental and physical restlessness, making it difficult to stay still or focus on a single task. This hyperactivity is not merely a behavioral quirk, but a manifestation of anxiety and an overactive nervous system. He compares it to a fight-or-flight response that remains permanently switched on, leading individuals to feel as though they must always be moving or engaged in something. At the other extreme, many individuals with ADD experience periods of profound lethargy and low motivation. This is not simple laziness, but a physiological shutdown response, similar to the freeze reaction seen in animals facing danger. When stress becomes overwhelming, the brain shifts from hyperactivity to a state of exhaustion and disengagement. Maté explains that this pendulum swing between restlessness and withdrawal is common in ADD, as individuals struggle to regulate their nervous system and find balance. He then delves into the role of shame, describing how many individuals with ADD internalize a sense of failure from an early age. Because their behaviors are often misunderstood or criticized, whether for being too restless, too forgetful, or too inattentive, they develop a deep-seated belief that they are inadequate. This shame further fuels the cycles of hyperactivity and lethargy, as individuals either overcompensate by trying to do too much or shut down entirely out of frustration and self-doubt. Maté concludes that the key to managing these cycles lies in understanding their emotional and neurological origins. Rather than forcing individuals with ADD into rigid behavioral expectations, he advocates for a compassionate approach that acknowledges their struggles, while providing tools for emotional and nervous system regulation. By addressing the root causes of hyperactivity, lethargy, and shame, individuals can begin to break free from the exhausting pendulum swing and develop a more stable and fulfilling way of engaging with the world. Chapter 16. It Ain't Over Till It's Over. Unconditional Positive Regard. Gabor Maté begins this chapter by addressing a common question: can individuals grow out of ADD? He argues that rather than focusing on a cure, the real need is for growth and healing. He emphasizes that children with ADD do not require a change in parenting techniques, but rather a shift in parenting attitudes. This shift must be grounded in a deeper understanding of the child, focusing on fostering development rather than just correcting behaviors. Similarly, adults with ADD must cultivate self-awareness and engage in self-parenting to address their struggles. Maté draws on neuroscience to support his optimistic perspective on ADD healing. He references the work of Dr. Marion Cleaves Diamond, a neuroscientist who demonstrated that brain development remains responsive to environmental changes throughout life. Through studies on rats, Diamond showed that enriched environments led to thicker cortical layers, larger nerve cells, and more elaborate neural branching, even in older animals. Maté extends this finding to humans, arguing that just as physical exercise strengthens muscles and cardiovascular health, positive emotional and intellectual stimulation can promote brain growth and self-regulation, even in adulthood. This scientific perspective underpins Maté's advocacy for unconditional positive regard, a concept borrowed from psychologist Carl Rogers. He explains that children, and later adults, need to feel valued not for their achievements or behaviors, but for their inherent worth. He critiques the traditional approach to discipline, which often conditions children to seek approval only when they behave in socially acceptable ways. Such conditional love, he argues, can exacerbate ADD traits by increasing anxiety and self-doubt. Instead, fostering a supportive, non-judgmental environment helps individuals with ADD build self-esteem and resilience. Maté further emphasizes that while early childhood experiences play a significant role in ADD development, they do not determine a person's fate. He refutes the notion that brain wiring is permanently fixed in early childhood, arguing instead that individuals can rewire their neural pathways through consistent positive experiences. This process is not immediate, but requires ongoing emotional support, self-reflection, and a commitment to change. By shifting from a mindset of deficit correction to one of growth, both children and adults with ADD can gradually develop better self-regulation and emotional balance. Chapter 17, Wooing the Child. Maté explores the importance of re-establishing emotional bonds between parents and children with ADD, arguing that behavioral problems often stem from a deep-seated sense of disconnection. He introduces the story of Brian, an 11-year-old boy with classic ADD symptoms, disorganization, mood swings, and emotional outbursts. His parents describe their home as chaotic, with frequent conflicts, difficulty in getting Brian to follow routines, and extreme resistance to authority. Rather than focusing on Brian's behavior as the core issue, Maté suggests that the real problem lies in the emotional dynamics between him and his parents. To address this, Maté advises Brian's parents to shift their approach from disciplining behavior to wooing their child back into a secure relationship. He explains that children with ADD often feel emotionally abandoned, even in households where parents are physically present. They interpret criticism, frustration, and attempts at control as rejection. Brian's resistance to his parents' authority, Maté suggests, is actually a defensive reaction to feeling disconnected. He recommends that his parents focus on rebuilding trust rather than imposing discipline. 3 months later, Brian's parents return with a markedly different report. By prioritizing their relationship with him over strict discipline, they have significantly reduced conflicts at home. While Brian's attention issues and organizational struggles persist, his emotional resilience has improved. He is less resistant to help, more motivated, and able to acknowledge his challenges without feeling attacked. His parents note that their change in attitude has led to a transformation in Brian's behavior, reinforcing Maté's argument that emotional connection is the foundation for healing ADD traits. Maté expands on this idea by introducing principles for rebuilding the parent-child bond. He emphasizes that parents must take active responsibility for fostering connection rather than waiting for the child to behave better. This includes inviting the child into positive interactions, demonstrating genuine enthusiasm for their company, and ensuring they feel wanted and valued. He also stresses the importance of avoiding judgment. Children with ADD already experience deep insecurities, and constant correction only reinforces their sense of failure. Instead, parents should focus on creating an environment where the child feels safe and accepted, allowing for natural emotional and cognitive growth. Ultimately, Maté argues that the goal is not just behavioral improvement, but the development of self-regulation. By cultivating a secure attachment, parents provide children with the emotional stability necessary to manage their impulses, emotions, and attention. This approach does not negate the potential use of medications or other interventions, but places them within a broader framework of emotional healing. He concludes that children with ADD thrive in environments where they feel deeply connected and understood, rather than merely controlled or corrected. Chapter 18. Like Fish in the Sea. Maté delves into the interconnected nature of family dynamics and individual development, arguing that children with ADD cannot be understood in isolation from their family systems. He begins with a biological analogy, comparing human families to ant colonies or other interdependent species. Just as ants' roles are shaped by their environment rather than predetermined by genetics, human behaviors, especially in childhood, are shaped by relational dynamics. He asserts that ADD symptoms are not just individual traits, but reflections of the broader emotional climate of a child's upbringing. He challenges the conventional perspective that ADD is solely an individual disorder, emphasizing that children primarily react rather than act independently. Their attention difficulties, impulsivity, and emotional dysregulation often mirror the stresses, anxieties, and relational patterns of their parents. Maté argues that by shifting focus from fixing the child to examining how parents respond to them, significant changes can occur. He cites the work of psychiatrist Michael Kerr, who emphasizes that when parents take responsibility for their own emotional regulation, children naturally follow suit. Maté then explores the concept of self-regulation, which he sees as the ultimate goal of both childhood development and ADD healing. He defines self-regulation as the ability to maintain emotional stability regardless of external circumstances. Children with ADD struggle with this because their early environments often lack the consistency and security necessary for developing this skill. When children experience chronic stress, uncertainty, or emotional disconnection, their nervous systems remain in a state of heightened reactivity, making self-regulation difficult. To address this, Maté advocates for a family-wide approach to healing. Instead of solely focusing on managing the child's symptoms, parents must work on their own emotional awareness and stability. He argues that by modeling self-regulation, maintaining clear yet flexible boundaries, and prioritizing emotional connection over behavioral control, parents can create an environment that supports their child's development. He warns against rigid discipline, explaining that punitive approaches often reinforce the very behaviors they aim to correct by increasing stress and disconnection. Maté concludes by reinforcing the idea that children with ADD are deeply sensitive to their surroundings. While this sensitivity can make them more vulnerable to stress, it also means they are highly responsive to positive changes. When parents and caregivers shift their focus from control to connection, children with ADD have the potential to thrive. Healing ADD, he argues, is not about fixing a disorder, but about fostering relationships that allow children to develop the self-regulation skills they need for a fulfilling life. Chapter 19. Just Looking for Attention. Gabor Maté challenges the common criticism that children with ADD are merely seeking attention. He argues that the need for attention is not a trivial matter, but a fundamental emotional necessity. The phrase, "just looking for attention," is a misunderstanding of what attention means to a child with ADD. Maté explains that attention is the cornerstone of emotional development. If a child has not received enough attuned, positive attention in their early years, they develop an attention deficit in the most literal sense, not just in terms of focus, but in their internal emotional balance. This is why ADD children appear to demand an excessive amount of attention, yet never seem satisfied with it. Maté describes a vicious cycle in which a child who has felt emotionally deprived begins to seek attention through disruptive or negative behaviors. The adult then responds with punishment, withdrawal, or frustration, which further deepens the child's sense of rejection. The child, feeling even more anxious, then acts out more aggressively, leading to harsher responses from caregivers. This cycle, he argues, is one of the main emotional underpinnings of ADD. A child will prefer negative attention over no attention at all, because any interaction, positive or negative, at least confirms their existence and importance. He introduces the concept of compassionate curiosity, urging parents and educators to look beyond behavior and ask what the child is trying to communicate. If a child persistently interrupts conversations or becomes overly demanding, it is not simply an issue of discipline but a sign of an unmet emotional need. By addressing this need proactively, offering connection before the child has to demand it, parents can help break the pattern. The key, Maté suggests, is to provide attention when the child is not demanding it, ensuring that their need for connection is fulfilled in a way that does not reinforce disruptive behavior. He also warns against the trap of trying to convince a child that they have already received enough attention. A parent may list all the ways they have engaged with the child that day, only for the child to respond with, "You never want to play with me." Maté explains that this is not a logical argument, but an expression of deep-seated emotional insecurity. Rather than countering with facts, the best response is to acknowledge the child's feelings while setting firm but loving boundaries on parental availability. Ultimately, Maté argues that children with ADD do not need to be taught to seek less attention. They need to feel secure in the attention they receive. The goal should be to create an environment where the child no longer feels the need to fight for connection. He urges parents to move away from a framework of rewards and punishments and instead focus on strengthening the child's sense of belonging and security, which will, in time, reduce their desperate need for external validation. Chapter 20: The Defiant One's Oppositionality. In this chapter, Maté explores the roots of oppositional behavior in individuals with ADD, challenging the assumption that defiance is simply a sign of stubbornness or a desire to provoke authority. He introduces the case of Stephen, a highly creative but impulsive man whose life had been marked by risk-taking, career instability, and a deeply ingrained oppositional streak. As a child, Stephen was an extraordinarily talented classical musician, but he abruptly abandoned his musical career in his mid-teens. When asked why, he cited a deep resentment toward his father, who had forced him to practice rigorously and punished him for resisting. Although Stephen regretted giving up music, Maté argues that his decision was not a mistake, but a necessary act of psychological self-preservation. Continuing under such oppressive conditions would have meant surrendering his autonomy. Maté introduces the concept of counterwill, a term originally coined by psychoanalyst Otto Rank and later expanded upon by psychologist Gordon Neufeld. Counterwill refers to the instinctive opposition that arises when an individual perceives an external force trying to control them. It is a natural defense mechanism, not a personality flaw. In young children, counterwill serves the developmental purpose of helping them differentiate themselves from their caregivers. However, in children with ADD, who often experience disrupted emotional attachments, counterwill can become extreme and persistent, leading to chronic oppositionality. He explains that children with ADD often resist authority not because they are inherently rebellious, but because they have not developed a strong, secure sense of self. Their defiance is not an expression of genuine autonomy, but a reactive mechanism against feeling controlled. This explains why children with ADD frequently refuse to follow instructions, argue endlessly, or resist even the most reasonable requests. Their opposition is not always about the specific demand being placed on them. Rather, it is a knee-jerk defense against perceived coercion. Maté cautions against traditional disciplinary approaches that rely on force, punishment, or coercion. These methods only escalate counterwill by reinforcing the child's perception that they must defend their autonomy at all costs. Instead, he advocates for approaches that maintain the child's sense of dignity and choice while still providing necessary structure. The best way to diffuse oppositionality, he suggests, is to focus on strengthening the attachment bond between the child and their caregiver. The more securely attached a child feels, the less they will feel the need to assert their independence through defiance. He also addresses the impact of counterwill in adults with ADD, many of whom struggle with authority figures, work hierarchies, and interpersonal relationships. Just as children resist parents and teachers, adults with ADD may reflexively push back against bosses, partners, or anyone they perceive as imposing control. Maté argues that the key to overcoming this pattern is self-awareness, recognizing that opposition is often an automatic reaction rather than a well-considered choice. By becoming conscious of this tendency, individuals with ADD can begin to reclaim true autonomy rather than being ruled by reactive defiance. Chapter 21. Diffusing counterwill. Maté provides a deeper exploration of counterwill and offers practical strategies for managing it, both in children and adults. He emphasizes that counterwill is not an inherently negative trait. It serves an important function in psychological development. However, when left unchecked, it can create a persistent cycle of conflict between children and caregivers. He describes counterwill as an immune response of the psyche. It exists to protect the individual from being overwhelmed by external influence. However, when a child's sense of self is underdeveloped, this protective mechanism can become overly rigid, leading to automatic resistance against any form of guidance or expectation. One of the most effective ways to reduce counterwill, Maté argues, is to strengthen the attachment bond. Children are far less likely to resist the influence of adults with whom they feel deeply connected. He advises parents to focus on maintaining warmth, connection, and trust, rather than relying on punishment or coercion. Instead of attempting to force compliance, parents should work on making their guidance feel like an extension of the relationship rather than an imposition of power. For example, a child who refuses to do their homework will likely respond better to a conversation about their interests and struggles than to a direct order or a threat. Maté also warns against mistaking compliance for genuine cooperation. A child who obeys out of fear of punishment or desire for external rewards is not truly developing self-regulation. In fact, excessive control can suppress counterwill in the short term, but lead to deeper problems later on, as suppressed resistance often emerges in adolescence or adulthood in more destructive ways. He concludes by arguing that counterwill is not something to be eliminated, but something to be understood and worked with. By recognizing its role in development and learning how to channel it constructively, parents and individuals with ADD can cultivate a healthier, more balanced sense of autonomy and cooperation. Chapter 22. My Marshmallow Caught Fire, Motivation and Autonomy. Gabor Maté explores the concept of motivation in individuals with ADD, arguing that motivation cannot be imposed from the outside but must arise from within. He begins by addressing a common frustration among parents and educators. Why do children with ADD struggle to motivate themselves, even when they express interest in a task? He references psychologist Natalie Rathvahn's description of the unmotivated child, which includes difficulties with independent work, trouble initiating and completing tasks, a short attention span, and frequent mood swings. These characteristics, Maté argues, align closely with those of ADD, suggesting that the issue is not laziness, but an internal disconnect from self-directed engagement. Maté explains that traditional motivation techniques, such as external rewards, punishments, or threats, may work temporarily, but ultimately undermine long-term self-motivation. When children are rewarded for completing tasks, they become dependent on external validation rather than cultivating an internal sense of purpose. Likewise, punishment often reinforces negative self-perceptions, leading children to associate work with anxiety rather than fulfillment. He argues that a more effective approach is to nurture autonomy, allowing children to engage with tasks on their own terms while providing the necessary support. A key component of this process is the attachment relationship between parent and child. Maté asserts that children who feel securely attached are more likely to develop internal motivation because they do not have to expend energy seeking approval or defending their autonomy. In contrast, children with insecure attachments often engage in counterwill, a reflexive resistance to being controlled, which can make them appear unmotivated when, in reality, they are simply rejecting external pressure. By fostering a sense of connection and trust, parents can help children develop the confidence to take responsibility for their own learning and actions. Maté also addresses the role of autonomy in motivation. He cites research showing that individuals who feel a sense of ownership over their choices are more likely to be persistent and engaged. When children with ADD are given too many external directives, they may become overwhelmed and disengage entirely. Instead, parents and teachers should encourage self-initiation by offering choices, setting reasonable expectations, and providing guidance without coercion. For example, instead of demanding that a child start their homework immediately, a parent might ask, "Would you like to start your homework now or in 15 minutes?" This approach respects the child's autonomy while still maintaining structure. Ultimately, Maté argues that true motivation comes from within and cannot be forced. The goal is to create an environment where children feel safe, supported, and in control of their own development. By prioritizing connection over compliance and autonomy over control, parents and educators can help children with ADD find the internal drive to succeed on their own terms. Chapter 23, Trusting the Child, Trusting Oneself, ADD in the Classroom. Maté critiques the traditional education system for failing to accommodate the unique learning styles of children with ADD. He argues that schools operate on the assumption that all children learn in the same way, which leaves many students struggling to fit into a rigid structure that does not support their cognitive and emotional needs. This failure is often misinterpreted as a problem with the child rather than a shortcoming of the system itself. Instead of viewing ADD as a discipline issue, Maté suggests that educators need to rethink how they approach learning, emphasizing trust, flexibility, and individualized support. He begins by highlighting the contradiction in modern education. Schools expect children to take responsibility for their learning, while simultaneously offering little autonomy in how they engage with material. Children with ADD, who already struggle with self-regulation, are particularly vulnerable in this system. When they fail to meet expectations, they are often punished or labeled as disruptive, reinforcing their sense of inadequacy. Maté argues that the key to effective teaching is trust, both in the child's ability to learn in their own way and in the teacher's capacity to guide without imposing rigid control. One of the primary issues, he explains, is that teachers often rely on external discipline to manage ADD students rather than addressing the root causes of their inattention. Many children with ADD struggle with classroom environments that are overstimulating, rigid, or devoid of meaningful engagement. Instead of forcing compliance, Maté suggests that teachers should create an atmosphere of curiosity and personal investment. This means allowing students to explore subjects in ways that interest them, adapting lesson structures to accommodate different learning styles, and recognizing that inattentiveness is often a symptom of emotional distress rather than defiance. Maté also discusses the importance of trust in education. He shares a letter from a specialized early childhood educator who argues that while teachers cannot provide unconditional parental love, they can create environments where students feel seen and understood. This simple act of recognition can transform a child's learning experience. By trusting students to engage with material in their own way and trusting themselves to adapt to each child's needs, teachers can foster a more effective and compassionate learning environment. Another key element is reducing the emphasis on rigid evaluation methods. Maté points out that traditional tests and time-pressured exams are often more reflective of a student's stress response than their actual understanding. Many children with ADD struggle in high-pressure situations, leading to poor academic performance that does not accurately represent their abilities. He advocates for more flexible assessment strategies that allow students to demonstrate knowledge in ways that align with their strengths. For example, allowing extra time on tests or providing alternative forms of evaluation, such as oral presentations or creative projects, can help ADD students succeed without unnecessary anxiety. Maté concludes by emphasizing that education should be about fostering a love of learning rather than enforcing conformity. When teachers shift their focus from controlling behavior to nurturing engagement, children with ADD are more likely to thrive. He calls for a fundamental rethinking of how schools operate, encouraging a move away from standardized approaches and toward individualized, trust-based learning environments. Chapter 24. Always on my case, teenagers. Maté examines the unique challenges of parenting teenagers with ADD, describing adolescence as a particularly volatile period for both children and their parents. He explains that as teenagers seek independence, their attachment needs shift from family to peer groups. This transition is especially difficult for teenagers with ADD who often struggle with social relationships and emotional regulation. The result is an intensified version of counterwill, the instinctive opposition to authority, that can make adolescence a period of heightened conflict. Parents often find themselves frustrated with their teenage children who seem disinterested in responsibility, resistant to guidance, and prone to impulsive decision-making. Maté argues that this is not simply a matter of defiance, but a reflection of deeper struggles with self-regulation and identity formation. Many teenagers with ADD feel misunderstood or rejected, leading them to push back even harder against parental expectations. At the same time, parents, feeling desperate to prepare their children for adulthood, may become increasingly controlling, which only exacerbates resistance. One of the biggest mistakes parents make, according to Maté, is trying to force compliance through pressure or punishment. This approach often backfires, leading teenagers to become even more oppositional. Instead, he advises parents to focus on maintaining a strong, unconditional connection with their child. Even when teenagers appear indifferent, they still crave parental acceptance and love. Parents should make space for autonomy while setting reasonable boundaries, ensuring that their child feels both supported and respected. Maté also addresses the importance of recognizing the teenager's perspective. Adolescents with ADD often struggle with self-esteem and may feel that their parents view them solely as a problem to be fixed. A more effective approach is to engage in open conversations, allowing teenagers to express their frustrations and fears without judgment. By validating their experiences and respecting their need for independence, parents can foster a more cooperative relationship. Ultimately, Maté argues that while adolescence is a challenging time, it is also an opportunity for growth. When parents shift from control to connection, teenagers with ADD can develop the confidence and self-regulation needed for a successful transition into adulthood. Chapter 25. Justifying one's existence, self-esteem. Gabor Maté explores the deep connection between self-esteem and ADD, emphasizing that low self-esteem is not merely a byproduct of ADD, but a defining trait woven into the disorder's psychological and emotional landscape. He opens with the story of Andrea, a 50-year-old woman who describes herself as having achieved nothing and feeling as though she has no excuse for existence. Her sentiment, he explains, is common among adults with ADD who often struggle with feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and shame. Maté argues that while external failures and setbacks can contribute to low self-esteem, they do not explain why individuals with ADD are particularly prone to such intense self-judgment. He suggests that their feelings of worthlessness stem from early childhood experiences rather than merely from adult life disappointments. One of the most damaging effects of ADD-related self-esteem issues, Maté notes, is the tendency toward compulsive overachievement or workaholism. Many ADD adults, he explains, throw themselves into their work or other high-intensity pursuits to compensate for their deep-seated fear of failure. He describes the driven and hyper-functioning workaholic who is constantly seeking validation through external accomplishments, but remains internally dissatisfied. This restlessness, he argues, is a way of numbing emotional pain. Even those who achieve great success in their careers often feel like imposters, as their self-worth remains tied to external performance rather than an intrinsic sense of value. Maté then examines the neurophysiological basis of self-esteem, explaining that the sense of self is not an inherent structure within the brain, but a construct formed by countless neurological circuits firing in rapid succession. In ADD, he suggests, this construct lacks stability, leading to greater emotional fluctuations and an inconsistent sense of self. Individuals with ADD may feel confident and capable one moment, only to be overwhelmed with self-doubt the next. This instability makes it difficult for them to develop the steady, secure sense of self necessary for healthy self-esteem. He explains that self-esteem requires a degree of self-regulation, something that ADD disrupts by making individuals prone to impulsive emotional swings. Another barrier to self-esteem among individuals with ADD is their difficulty in recognizing and pursuing their own intrinsic desires. Maté describes how many ADD adults suppress their true impulses in favor of what they believe they should be doing, often leading them to feel disconnected from their own passions and interests. He cites the example of a man who kept a diary filled with aspirations, learning new languages, exercising, meditating, but never took action on them, instead feeling stuck in a cycle of self-judgment and frustration. Maté suggests that attaining self-esteem requires bringing these buried impulses to light and acting upon them, rather than continually seeking external validation. Ultimately, he argues that true self-esteem is not about achievement or external validation, but about unconditional self-acceptance. He contrasts contingent self-esteem, which depends on accomplishments, social approval, or comparison with others, with true self-esteem, which is independent of external factors. For individuals with ADD, developing true self-esteem requires a shift away from self-judgment and towards self-understanding. He concludes that self-esteem is not something to be earned through productivity, but something to be cultivated through self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the willingness to embrace one's authentic self. Chapter 26. Memories are made of this. In this chapter, Maté explores the nature of memory, particularly its inconsistencies and distortions, in individuals with ADD. He begins by highlighting a paradox. While many ADD adults struggle with forgetfulness, they also tend to experience powerful emotional memories that shape their self-perception. He introduces the concept of implicit memory, explaining that not all memories are consciously recalled. Implicit memory consists of deeply ingrained emotional and physiological responses that influence behavior without individuals being aware of them. These unconscious memories, Maté argues, often dictate how people with ADD respond to stress, relationships, and self-worth. He illustrates the power of implicit memory with the case of Elsa, a woman who had an extreme emotional reaction upon witnessing teenagers mocking an overweight man on the bus. Without consciously understanding why, she found herself yelling at the teenagers in a state of uncontrollable anger. Similarly, another patient, David, described feeling paralyzed when he witnessed police officers roughly handling an elderly woman. In both cases, Maté suggests that these individuals were not reacting solely to the present situation, but were reliving past experiences of helplessness, shame, or injustice. The ADD brain, he explains, tends to be highly sensitive to perceived unfairness or emotional wounds, leading to heightened reactions that may seem disproportionate to the present moment. Maté then discusses how memory functions in the ADD brain, arguing that it does not operate like a video recorder, but rather as a dynamic reconstruction of past experiences. He explains that memories are stored across multiple neural circuits, including those responsible for emotions, sensory perception, and language. When individuals recall an event, they are not retrieving a perfect record, but rather piecing together fragments influenced by their current emotional state. This is why people with ADD often struggle with recalling important details while simultaneously being overwhelmed by emotionally charged memories. He highlights the impact of stress and anxiety on memory, noting that when individuals with ADD are placed in high-pressure situations, such as exams or conflicts, their ability to retrieve information often shuts down. This is because stress triggers implicit fear memories, which override explicit memory recall. He describes how students with ADD may study extensively for an exam only to blank out when faced with the pressure of proving their knowledge. This, he argues, is not a failure of intelligence, but a result of how stress affects neural processing. Maté concludes that understanding memory's role in ADD can help individuals navigate their emotional responses more effectively. Rather than blaming themselves for forgetfulness or overreactivity, he encourages individuals to recognize how their past experiences shape their present behavior. By cultivating mindfulness and self-awareness, people with ADD can begin to disentangle past emotional imprints from current situations, allowing for more balanced and thoughtful reactions. Chapter 27. Remembering What Didn't Happen, the ADD Relationship. Maté delves into the unique challenges that ADD presents in romantic relationships, particularly in how individuals with ADD experience emotional attachment. He begins with the story of Trevor, a stockbroker in his 30s who has struggled with maintaining long-term relationships. Trevor frequently loses interest in partners shortly after pursuing them, yet he also experiences extreme distress when he feels a woman is pulling away. This contradictory pattern, craving connection yet fearing intimacy, is, according to Maté, deeply rooted in implicit memory. Trevor is not merely reacting to his present relationships, he is reliving the emotional wounds of his early childhood. Maté introduces the concept of the ahistorical memory of the ADD mind, explaining that individuals with ADD often function as if past emotional wounds never occurred, until they are suddenly triggered. He describes how the ADD brain struggles to maintain a consistent emotional narrative. When experiencing happiness, an individual may have difficulty recalling past struggles, and when feeling rejected, they may forget previous moments of connection. This tendency leads to extreme emotional fluctuations in relationships, as partners may feel alternately idealized and abandoned, depending on the ADD individual's current emotional state. He also explores how individuals with ADD tend to seek out relationships that unconsciously mirror unresolved childhood dynamics. Many find themselves drawn to emotionally unavailable partners or recreate patterns of abandonment and rejection. He argues that breaking these cycles requires conscious effort to separate past emotional wounds from present-day interactions. By developing self-awareness and emotional regulation, individuals with ADD can learn to build more stable and fulfilling relationships. Chapter 28. Moses Saved by the Angel, Self-Parenting. Gabor Maté introduces the concept of self-parenting as a necessary approach for adults with ADD, emphasizing that the challenges they face in adulthood stem largely from unmet developmental needs in childhood. He argues that while children with ADD require attentive and nurturing guidance from caregivers, adults with ADD must learn to provide that same support for themselves. The challenge, however, is that ADD interferes with self-regulation, motivation, and self-esteem, making it difficult for individuals to take on the role of both parent and child in their own lives. Maté draws on a Jewish legend about Moses to illustrate the internal conflict ADD adults experience. According to the legend, as a child, Moses was given a choice between an onyx stone, symbolizing power and ambition, and a burning coal, representing suffering and limitation. Guided by an unseen angel, Moses' hand was directed toward the coal, leaving him physically scarred but spiritually preserved. Maté uses this story to explain the experience of ADD adults who, rather than developing a clear and confident sense of self, have been conditioned to suppress their core impulses and adopt patterns of self-denial. The angel, in this analogy, represents the mechanisms of survival that helped ADD individuals adapt to early life challenges, but now leave them struggling with self-doubt and emotional wounds. A key element of self-parenting, Maté argues, is compassionate curiosity, the ability to examine one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without judgment. He stresses that many ADD adults have internalized negative self-perceptions from childhood, reinforcing feelings of inadequacy and failure. To heal, they must learn to engage with their experiences in a non-critical way, asking themselves not, "What is wrong with me?" but rather, "Why do I feel this way?" This shift in mindset allows for self-acceptance, which is essential for personal growth. Another crucial aspect of self-parenting is developing a new relationship with guilt and anxiety. Maté explains that guilt often serves as an internalized mechanism from childhood, deterring individuals from pursuing their own needs for fear of disappointing others. ADD adults, he notes, frequently struggle with saying no or asserting their boundaries due to a deep-seated fear of rejection. To break this pattern, they must learn to tolerate feelings of guilt without allowing it to dictate their actions. Similarly, anxiety around self-assertion can be a powerful force, preventing individuals from expressing themselves authentically. By acknowledging these emotions as remnants of past experiences rather than immutable truths, ADD adults can begin to reclaim their autonomy. Maté concludes that self-parenting is not a process of instant transformation, but an ongoing journey of self-awareness and self-care. ADD adults must cultivate patience with themselves, understanding that healing decades of conditioning will take time. He urges them to approach their struggles with kindness, recognizing that the very traits that once hindered them, such as sensitivity, impulsivity, and intense emotions, can become sources of strength when properly understood and managed. Chapter 29. The Physical and Spiritual Environment, Self-Parenting. In this chapter, Maté expands on the concept of self-parenting by discussing the crucial role of the environment in the healing process. He argues that adults with ADD often live in chaotic physical and mental spaces that mirror their internal struggles. Because ADD is characterized by disorganization and impulsivity, many individuals fail to recognize the impact of their surroundings on their well-being. Creating a supportive external environment, he asserts, is a fundamental aspect of self-care. He begins with the importance of physical space, explaining that clutter and disarray can exacerbate the ADD mind's tendency toward distraction and overwhelm. Many ADD adults claim to function well in disorder, but Maté challenges this belief, arguing that a cluttered environment reinforces internal chaos. He suggests that individuals with ADD take conscious control of their space, not as a rigid rule, but as a self-directed choice that fosters stability. Even small steps such as tidying a workspace or organizing daily routines can significantly improve cognitive function and emotional regulation. Next, he addresses nutrition and physical health, which are often neglected by ADD adults. He explains that ADD individuals are particularly sensitive to fluctuations in blood sugar, which can dramatically impact mood, focus, and energy levels. Poor eating habits, such as skipping meals, consuming excessive caffeine or sugar, and eating erratically, can worsen ADD symptoms. He encourages ADD adults to adopt consistent, balanced eating patterns, recognizing that proper nutrition is not just a physical necessity, but a crucial component of mental well-being. Maté also emphasizes the role of exercise in self-parenting. Regular physical activity, he explains, supports dopamine production and enhances emotional stability, both of which are crucial for ADD individuals. Many ADD adults struggle with structured exercise routines, so he advises incorporating movement into daily life in enjoyable and sustainable ways. Whether through walking, yoga, martial arts, or other activities, regular exercise can help regulate mood and improve focus. Beyond the physical, Maté explores the importance of solitude and mindfulness in cultivating self-awareness. The ADD mind, he notes, is inherently restless, making practices like meditation and quiet reflection particularly challenging. However, he argues that these practices are essential for breaking the cycle of distraction and impulsivity. Even short moments of mindfulness, such as focusing on breath, engaging with nature, or practicing deep listening, can help ADD adults develop greater control over their attention and emotions. He describes contemplative solitude as a way to strengthen self-connection, allowing individuals to process their thoughts without the constant stimulus of external distractions. He concludes by discussing the role of spiritual exploration in self-parenting. While not advocating for any specific religious practice, he suggests that engaging with a broader sense of meaning, whether through meditation, philosophical inquiry, or creative pursuits, can be deeply beneficial for ADD adults. The fragmented nature of the ADD mind often leaves individuals feeling disconnected from themselves and others, and spiritual engagement can provide a grounding force. He encourages ADD adults to explore whatever practices bring them a sense of peace and coherence, whether that be time in nature, artistic expression, or structured meditation. Maté's overarching message in this chapter is that self-parenting requires a holistic approach. Addressing ADD is not simply a matter of behavioral strategies or medication, it requires cultivating a life structure that supports growth. By consciously shaping their physical and mental environments, ADD adults can create the conditions necessary for self-regulation and fulfillment. Chapter 30, In Place of Tears and Sorrow, Addictions and the ADD Brain. Maté examines the deep link between ADD and addiction, arguing that many individuals with ADD turn to addictive behaviors as a way to cope with their inner turmoil. He begins by stating that all addictions, whether to substances, activities, or emotional patterns, function as anesthetics. They provide temporary relief from the distress of an unregulated mind, allowing individuals to escape their discomfort. However, this relief is fleeting, and the underlying emotional pain remains unresolved. He explains that ADD brains are particularly vulnerable to addiction because they have deficient dopamine levels, making it harder to experience motivation, pleasure, and satisfaction. Many addictive substances, such as nicotine, alcohol, and stimulants, temporarily elevate dopamine, providing a sense of focus and emotional balance. Similarly, behavioral addictions, like gambling, compulsive shopping, or thrill-seeking, offer temporary dopamine boosts. This neurological imbalance, combined with the emotional struggles ADD individuals face, creates a high-risk scenario for addiction. Maté also explores the emotional roots of addiction, linking it to early childhood stress and attachment wounds. Many ADD individuals experienced inconsistent or neglectful caregiving, leading to a chronic sense of unease and emotional dysregulation. Addiction, he argues, is often an unconscious attempt to recreate lost emotional equilibrium. True healing, therefore, requires addressing not just the addiction itself, but the emotional pain that fuels it. He concludes by stressing that overcoming addiction in ADD requires both biological and psychological healing. Addressing dopamine imbalances, developing healthier coping strategies, and fostering self-compassion are all necessary steps toward breaking the cycle of addiction. Chapter 31. I Never Saw the Trees, What Medications Can and Cannot Do. Gabor Maté explores the role of medication in treating ADD, arguing that while pharmaceutical intervention can be beneficial, it is neither a cure nor a complete solution. He begins by acknowledging the widespread use of stimulant medications such as Ritalin and Dexedrine, which have been commonly prescribed for ADD treatment for decades. These drugs work by stimulating activity in the brain's frontal cortex, helping individuals improve focus and impulse control. However, Maté raises concerns about the way these medications are often used, particularly when they are presented as a first-line solution rather than one component of a holistic approach. One of Maté's key criticisms is that medications are sometimes prescribed primarily for the convenience of adults rather than the well-being of the child. He recounts cases where parents were told that unless their child took medication, they would not be allowed to attend school. He argues that such coercion reflects deeper systemic issues, such as inadequate school resources and a failure to accommodate children with different learning needs. The dramatic rise in Ritalin prescriptions, particularly in regions like Quebec, correlates with a reduction in specialized education staff, suggesting that medication is being used as a substitute for proper support. Despite this criticism, Maté does not reject medication outright. He presents compelling anecdotes from individuals whose lives were transformed by stimulant treatment. One patient, a 54-year-old woman, reported that after taking dexedrine for the first time, she was suddenly able to appreciate the beauty of the trees outside her home, something she had never consciously noticed before. Another adult, a 40-year-old man, described how medication helped him assert himself for the first time in his life. These examples illustrate the potential benefits of medication, particularly in improving focus and self-awareness. However, Maté stresses that medication alone does not address the root causes of ADD. Many individuals, particularly adults, find that while stimulants help with concentration, they do not resolve deeper emotional struggles such as low self-esteem, chronic stress, or difficulties in relationships. He warns against the assumption that medication can fix ADD or replace the need for personal growth and therapy. Furthermore, he acknowledges that some individuals experience significant side effects, including anxiety, loss of appetite, and insomnia. Because medication reactions vary from person to person, finding the right treatment often requires trial and error. He concludes that medication should not be the sole focus of treatment, but rather one tool among many. While stimulants can be highly effective in managing symptoms, true healing requires a broader approach that includes emotional support, lifestyle changes, and self-understanding. Rather than viewing ADD as a purely medical disorder, Maté urges individuals to recognize its psychological and social dimensions, ensuring that treatment goes beyond symptom management to address the deeper issues at play. Chapter 32. What it means to attend. In this final chapter, Maté reflects on the broader meaning of attention, both in the context of ADD and in human experience more generally. He opens with the words of a 50-year-old interior designer named Elizabeth, who describes having spent her entire life pretending to be normal. Like many adults with ADD, she has learned to mask her struggles by suppressing her intensity, feigning interest in conversations that bore her, and trying to conform to social expectations. However, she finds this effort exhausting and ultimately futile. Maté uses her story to highlight the emotional toll of living with ADD, particularly in a society that values conformity over authenticity. He argues that the real challenge for individuals with ADD is not just learning to focus, but learning to accept themselves. Many people with ADD expend enormous energy trying to fit in, fearing that their natural way of being is unacceptable. However, Maté suggests that what others react against is not their uniqueness, but their own self-rejection. He asserts that the world is more willing to accept those who embrace their differences than those who struggle to suppress them. For both children and adults with ADD, the key to healing is not to force themselves into a mold, but to cultivate self-awareness and self-compassion. Maté also connects attention to love, arguing that to truly attend to something is an act of deep care and connection. He draws on the etymology of the word attend, which comes from the Latin tendere, meaning to stretch. To attend to another person, or to oneself, is to extend oneself outward, to engage fully with the present moment. This, he suggests, is the essence of true presence and healing. He critiques modern society for fostering distraction and disconnection, arguing that the ability to truly attend to oneself, to others, and to life itself is a skill that must be cultivated with intention. He concludes with a call for a shift in perspective on ADD. Rather than seeing it as a disorder to be fixed, he urges individuals to view it as a unique way of experiencing the world, one that, with the right support, can be embraced rather than merely managed. Healing, he argues, is not about eliminating symptoms, but about developing the capacity for deep presence, self-acceptance, and meaningful connection with others. In this way, the struggle with ADD becomes not just a challenge, but an opportunity for profound personal growth. And that's a wrap on Scattered Minds by Gabor Maté. If you found these insights valuable, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your biggest takeaways. And if there's a book you'd like me to summarize next, let me know in the comments. See you in the next one. With much love and gratitude.